Today we're going to continue our survey through the letter of Paul to the Colossians, beginning with chapter 3, verse 18, and continuing through chapter 4, verse 1. So, as we've been doing, we'll let Paul and Timothy read those verses for us.
Wives, submit to your husbands, as is fitting in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives, and do not be harsh with them. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Fathers, do not provoke your children, lest they become discouraged. Slaves, obey in everything those who are your earthly masters, not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. Whatever you do, work heartily, as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Christ. For the wrongdoer will be paid back for the wrong he has done, and there is no partiality. Masters, treat your slaves justly and fairly, knowing that you also have a master in heaven.
Okay, that odd break in there was occasioned by the chapter break between the end of verse 18 and chapter 4, verse 1. But taken together, these verses are what is called Paul's household code. And in verse 17 of chapter 3, which we heard last time, he's instructed the Colossians to do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus. And the instruction is given in the context of describing how worship is to take place, but clearly Paul means it to extend and have application to all of everyday life. In the passage we're considering now, Paul is going to take that instruction to do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus and apply it to the three most common relationships that the Christians in Colossae would have experienced: that of husband and wife, parents and children, and master and slaves. And the key dynamic across all three relationship pairings is submission within the established hierarchy. Everybody at the time was insisting on this. Both the Jews and the philosophy and popular culture of Greco-Roman culture had what we would call station codes, descriptions of how people should behave in various social relationships. And often the specific codes address the same three pairings as we see here. The key difference with Paul's writing here and in the more extended parallel passage in the 5th chapter of his letter to the Ephesians is the reciprocity between each of the members of each pair. Along with Jewish and Greek thinkers, Paul insists on the same duties to superiors on the part of those who are considered to be social inferiors. But unlike these thinkers, Paul is unique in his insistence that the so-called superiors have reciprocal duties to their inferiors. That being said, these codes are conservative in nature. Paul is not advocating feminism. He's not advocating the entire emancipation of children. He's not advocating ending slavery as practiced in Roman society. He's urging Christians to live within the social structures of the existing society. The net impact is an apologetic benefit. Christians, in his context, would be able to present the gospel to their neighbors as being conformable to the existing social order. They would be able to say, we're not a secret sect, we're not some wild-eyed subversives seeking to upend the Roman Empire and its structures and traditions. Each of the three codes in this section displays a pattern. Each party in the relationship is named, in every case the inferior first, then a command is given to each, and then a motivating factor for the required behavior is spelled out. What's in common in each of the situations is that in some way or another, the behavior is required as in the Lord or as pleasing to the Lord. 7 times in these verses, the Lord is mentioned. Both Jews and Greeks would have agreed that the required behaviors were fitting and appropriate, certainly on the part of the inferior parties, and even to a certain extent in the case of the superiors. But Jews would have said this was so because of the law. Thoughtful Greeks would have said, well, this is the order of things. Paul is unique in ascribing the ultimate motivation for keeping his commands across the board, whether superiors or inferiors, to a personal relationship with the Lord. Another common feature in each of the three sets of relationships is that each set is in the context of the household. Greek culture in particular saw the well-being of the household in each of these three sets of relationships as essential to the well-being of the state. For the first Christians, the household was likewise the setting for the church. There were no dedicated church buildings, probably until the middle of the 3rd century. So the well-run household in that context would become a model for the well-run church. The most vital person in the overall setting was the father of the family as head of the household. In Roman culture, indeed, he was the absolute despot over his household. He's addressed in these three sets of relationships not just once, but in each one. First, in his most involved role as husband, then as father of his children, then as master over the household slaves. That's the overview. Finally, a few thoughts on each one of the three relationship pairings. First, wives and husbands. Wives in this passage are called on to submit to their husbands. The emphasis here is on the voluntary nature of the response, not the relative status. In other places, the same word we translate here, submit, is used to indicate mutual submission on the part of equals, including, ultimately, of Christ to God. That's in 1 Corinthians 15:28. Otherwise, male hierarchy as exhibited in this passage is simply reflective of the then unquestioned cultural expectation. But here, as in the more extended passage in Ephesians chapter 5, the husband has an obligation too, to love his wife. And the kind of love involved is the self-sacrificing, self-giving love of Christ, supremely displayed on the cross. A high calling indeed. Second, children and parents. Here, the focus is more on behavior than on the accompanying mindset, and that's appropriate to the context. At the same time, Paul is assuming that the children being addressed are present in the meeting when this letter is being read, and he treats them as responsible agents despite their youth. In the ancient world, children were expected to honor their parents broadly. Paul narrows the focus more to obedience. On the reflexive side of the equation, it's fathers who are addressed here rather than parents. Again, in the Roman world, the father was the parent with the legal right to control the child. Again, it's unusual that Paul addresses the superior figure in the pair with an obligation not to make the child lose heart and become timid. Third, slaves and masters. The bulk of Paul's specific instruction in this section is to the slaves. Perhaps this is because slavery was such a common institution in Roman culture. While it was not of the oppressive, degrading quality known in our own history, slavery in the Roman world nonetheless resulted in the loss of a lot of freedom. Paul's concern here is mostly that slaves give good service, whether their masters behave justly or not. That's not only so that the gospel will be well represented, but also for the well-being of the slaves themselves. Serving their masters as they would serve the Lord frees slaves, as the commentator James Dunn writes, from the personal cost of suppressing aspects of the personality or engaging in repeated calculations how to do the minimum, thereby feeding resentment and bitterness. Both slaves and masters are exhorted, finally, to remember that they have a master in heaven who shows no favoritism. He will judge all, slave and master alike, with absolute impartiality. To the slave, this is an encouragement to persevere even in difficult circumstances. To the master, it's more in the form of a warning not to mistreat the slave. Well, that's Paul's household code. Next time we'll wrap up the book of Ephesians with some final comments and remarks.